What if Issei Sed+Ce by Venolana at her mansion? The iron gates of the Gremory estate rose before Issei Sed like the entrance to another world. Because, of course, it was exactly that. He had been to the underworld before. He'd fought in the raiding game on these very grounds, watched Rias's magic tear through opponents like crimson silk through water. He knew the Gremory clan was powerful. He understood, in the abstract way that humans understand things beyond their natural comprehension, that Rias came from nobility that made earthly aristocracy look like a school play. But standing outside the main manor, not the combat arena, not the guest wing, but the actual family residence, with a personal invitation card embossed in gold and sealed with the Gremory crest clutched in his sweaty palm, Issei felt the full weight of that understanding settle onto him for the very first time. He tugged at the collar of the suit Asia had insisted he wear. It was charcoal gray, tailored, a gift from Rias last winter that he had only worn once, to a formal devil gathering he mostly slept through. Asia had spent 40 minutes that morning getting the collar right, her small hands smoothing the lapels with serious concentration, while Kaneko observed from the doorway and declared the whole exercise unnecessary. "You're meeting Lady Venolana," Asia had said, wide-eyed with an awe she didn't bother concealing. "Issei-san? Lady Venolana?" He hadn't needed the reminder. The name alone had been enough to make him stand straighter. The invitation had arrived 2 days ago, delivered by a Gremory servant, a young devil woman in formal livery who had appeared in his bedroom at 7 in the morning with the kind of serene efficiency that suggested his shock and dishevelment were simply beneath her notice. Rias had left for the underworld the day before, something about the annual territorial review of the Gremory domain, a clan obligation she couldn't defer, and the invitation had come in her absence. Not addressed to the peerage. Not to Kiba or Aquino. To him specifically, Issei Sed. Pawn. Please attend the Gremory family estate at your earliest convenience, on the occasion of Lady Venolana Gremory's wish for your company. He had read it 6 times before he accepted it wasn't a mistake. A servant appeared at the gate now, not the same woman, but equally composed, and led him up a stone path lined with flowering trees that didn't exist anywhere on earth. Their blossoms were deep red, almost black at the center, and they shed petals in a slow, deliberate spiral as if the air itself was performing choreography. The manor beyond was vast without being ostentatious, which somehow made it more impressive than if it had simply been enormous. It was the architecture of people who had never needed to prove anything to anyone and had built accordingly. He was shown into a receiving room that was probably larger than his entire house in Kuo. The ceiling was painted with a sweeping mural, devils in flight against the twilight sky, rendered in shades of violet and crimson and deep gold, with a precision and beauty that made his chest do something complicated. The furniture was dark wood and deep burgundy velvet. There were flowers arranged in crystal vases, vivid and strange, and the room smelled of something warm and layered, like cinnamon and old books and something else underneath that he couldn't name. He stood in the center of it, and tried not to look like he was calculating how much everything cost. "You're staring at the ceiling." The voice was composed. Musical in the way that water over stone is musical, effortless, precisely measured, containing within it the suggestion of enormous depth. Issei turned. Venolana Gremory entered the room with the unhurried grace of someone who had never been required to rush anywhere in her life. She wore a deep burgundy gown, long-sleeved and high-collared, with her dark crimson hair, darker than Rias's, the color of dried roses, swept up in an arrangement that somehow managed to look both formal and intimate at once. She was, Issei thought with the helpless clarity of someone observing an obvious fact, extraordinarily beautiful. Not in Rias's warm, vivid way, or Aquino's deliberate and knowing way. Venolana's beauty was architectural. Composed. The kind that had existed for centuries and had no particular interest in being noticed, because it had long since moved past needing anything from anyone. Her eyes, the same deep violet as Rias's though stiller, like a lake versus a river, found him and settled with the comfortable authority of someone entirely at home in every room they entered. "I painted it myself," she said. 300 years ago. I was going through a phase." Issei blinked. Looked up at the ceiling again, at the complex, breathtaking sweep of figures and sky, then back at her. "You painted that?" "I was bored," she said simply, as if this explained everything, because for her it probably did. "Please sit." he sat. She arranged herself across from him with a movement so natural it barely registered as deliberate, though he was already beginning to suspect that everything Venolana Gremory did was deliberate. A servant materialized with tea before Issei had consciously registered there was a servant in the room. The cup placed before him was porcelain so thin it was nearly translucent, with a pattern of red flowers along the rim that matched nothing in the room and yet belonged perfectly. "I apologize for the short notice of the invitation," she said, lifting her own cup with slender fingers. "I should have liked to give you more time to prepare. Though I notice you've prepared quite thoroughly." Her gaze moved briefly to his suit. Issei had the sudden irrational certainty that she knew Asia had spent 40 minutes on his collar. "I wanted to make a good impression," he said, "because there was no point in pretending otherwise." "You did." She set her cup down with the faint sound of precision. "You're honest. I appreciate that. My daughter's household is full of people who are very skilled at telling me what they think I want to hear. You don't seem to have that instinct." "I've never been very good at it," he admitted. "No," she agreed, studying him with that still, deep gaze. "I don't suppose you have." There was something in her assessment that wasn't dismissive, more like someone examining a material they hadn't worked with before and finding it genuinely interesting. "You must be wondering why you're here." "A little bit, yeah." The corner of her mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile but suggested the architecture of one, like a building you know is beautiful even while it's still under construction. "My daughter speaks of you constantly. More, I think, than she realizes. She speaks of your strength, naturally. Your persistence. The way you refuse to accept defeat even when you have been comprehensively outmatched." She tilted her head a degree. "She spoke of you for nearly half an hour before she left for the territorial review without, I believe, once noticing that she had been speaking of you for half an hour. I found that very informative." Issei felt warmth crawl up the back of his neck. "Rias she's important to me. She's always been." "I know what Rias is to you," Venolana said, with a gentleness that cut more cleanly than sharpness would have. "What I wanted to understand is what you are. As a person, not as a piece, or a dragon host, or a boy who made a name for himself in a raiding game. As Issei Sed+Ce." She looked at him directly. "So I invited you to dinner." Dinner, as it turned out, was not the word Issei would have chosen. The word dinner implied a table, some food, perhaps polite conversation about neutral topics. What Venolana had arranged was a 4-course meal in a private dining room lit by floating lights in shades of amber and rose gold, served by staff who appeared and disappeared with such practiced invisibility that Issei half believed they were ghosts wearing uniforms as a courtesy. The table was set for 2 and only 2, no advisors, no attendants hovering at Lady Venolana's shoulder, no buffer between them of the kind that nobility always seemed to require. Just Venolana at one end, Issei at the other, close enough that conversation required no effort, and wine poured from bottles that he suspected were older than entire human civilizations. He ate carefully. He was aware, in a way he couldn't fully articulate, that this was some kind of examination, not cruel, not a trap exactly, but a measuring. He asked about the wine when it was poured, because he genuinely didn't know what he was drinking and pretending otherwise felt pointless. Venolana explained it with patient detail, tracing the vineyard's history back 4 centuries with the ease of someone describing their own backyard, and managed somehow to make him feel like the subject was fascinating rather than like he was being instructed in things he should already know. He told her about growing up in Co. His parents, his father's laugh, his mother's cooking, the ordinary texture of a life he'd lived without understanding how lucky it was to be ordinary. He told her about the first time he'd seen a devil and thought it was a nightmare. She listened with genuine, undivided attention, her chin resting lightly on one hand, her eyes on his face. "You were afraid," she said, when he described those first disorienting days. "I was terrified," he said. "I didn't know what any of it meant. I didn't understand the rules. I barely understood that there were rules, and then," he thought about it for a moment, "and then I just kept going. Because there wasn't really another option, was there? You find out the world is bigger and stranger and more dangerous than you thought, and you can either stop moving or you figure out how to stand in it." He turned his wine glass slowly. "I was never very good at stopping." Venolana was quiet for a moment that felt considered rather than empty. "That," she said, is exactly the kind of thing my daughter said you would say. Is that good? It's true, she said. Which I find considerably preferable to good. She refilled his wine herself, reaching across without summoning a servant. A gesture he was starting to understand was not casual but chosen. You love her. It wasn't a question. He answered it anyway. Yeah, he said. I do. I've loved her since. I don't know exactly when it became love and not just admiration, or gratitude, or something I didn't have a word for yet. But it's love. It's the kind where I want her to be happy more than I want anything for myself. He looked at the dark surface of the wine. That probably sounds naive. It sounds sincere, Venolana said. Naivete and sincerity are frequently confused. The difference is in the willingness to carry the full weight of what one feels, without putting it down when it becomes inconvenient. She studied him across the candlelight. You carry it. He looked up to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read, something layered, like the wine, like the mural on the ceiling of the receiving room. Appreciative, he thought. Thoughtful, and something else beneath both of those, something quieter and more carefully controlled, that she had not entirely intended for him to see and that she allowed him to see anyway. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He ate the last of the fourth course, something sweet that tasted like dark berries and starlight, which was a ridiculous thought and also the most accurate description he could manage, and the floating lights dimmed incrementally, as if the room was making a gentle, ambient suggestion. A servant appeared with a folded note on a silver tray. Venolana received it, read it, and set it aside with an expression of mild inconvenience that could not possibly have been rehearsed because it was too subtle to be performance. The transit roads between the estate and the nearest travel point are undergoing structural maintenance tonight, she said. It's a common enough occurrence in this district. I should have checked the schedule before extending the invitation. She looked at him with those composed violet eyes that told him, quite clearly, absolutely everything. I'm afraid you'll need to stay the night. The East Wing guest suite is prepared. I hope that isn't inconvenient. Issei looked at her. He looked at the note. He looked back at her. He was many things, brave past the point of wisdom, stubborn in ways that regularly alarmed people who cared about him, occasionally so oblivious to social nuance that his peerage had developed a private system of significant looks designed to communicate. Issei, please notice what is happening right now. He was not, in this particular moment, oblivious. He was aware, with a clarity that sat low in his chest like a warm coal, that a very beautiful, very powerful, very deliberate woman was watching him across a candlelit table, and that the note on the silver tray had arrived at a precise and convenient moment, and that everything about this evening had been constructed with an architect's attention to detail by someone who had 3 centuries of experience in the construction of moments. He was also aware that he had absolutely no idea what to do about that, or what he wanted to do about it, or whether those were even the same question. No, he said carefully. That's not a problem. Venolana rose from the table in a single fluid movement. Good. That almost smile, fully formed for just a moment before it receded back into composure. I'll have you shown to your room. Sleep well, Issei. It was the first time she had used his given name without his family name attached. He noticed. She knew he noticed. Neither of them said anything about it. The guest suite in the East Wing was, like everything else in the manor, quietly extraordinary. The bed was wide enough to feel like a landscape. The sheets were silk, real silk, the kind that held temperature like memory, cool where he first lay down and then gradually, precisely warm. The curtains were floor-to-ceiling burgundy, and when they were drawn, the room became its own closed world. There was a writing desk of dark wood with paper and ink laid out as though someone had considered that he might want to compose his thoughts. There was a bookshelf stocked with volumes in 3 different languages, none of which he could read, though the spines were beautiful. There was a window, tall, arched, that looked out onto the rose garden below, and through it came the underworld's version of night, a sky without stars in the terrestrial sense, but luminous, the darkness itself having a quality of depth and color, deep blue-violet that was nothing like the black of earthly nights. He stood at the window for a while, looking at the roses. They were red. Deeply, almost impossibly red, the kind of red that seems lit from within even in low light, and they were perfectly still in the windless underworld air. There were hundreds of them. The garden was formal, laid out in geometric patterns that somehow avoided coldness, the way all the best designed things manage to be precise without being inhuman. He thought about Venolana. He thought about her with the careful, honest attention he tried to give to things that mattered, rather than the impulsive rush that governed a lot of his decision-making in battle and had gotten him killed at least once. She was Rias's mother. That was the first, foundational, immovable fact. She was the matriarch of one of the most powerful devil clans in existence. She was centuries old, composed, brilliant, and in possession of a beauty and gravity that operated on a frequency he wasn't sure his human-born instincts were properly calibrated to process. She had invited him here specifically, alone, and had spent an entire evening learning him, not testing him in the way opponents test each other before a fight, but learning him, the way you learn something you intend to keep, and she had said goodnight with his name in her mouth like it was familiar. Like it had been there before. He pressed his forehead briefly against the cool glass of the window. He loved Rias. That was real and solid and certain, a fact about himself as reliable as his own heartbeat. It was not in question. What he felt when he thought about Rias was the kind of love that he had grown into gradually, that had started as awe and gratitude and had deepened through shared danger and chosen loyalty into something that felt like home, like the person, not the place. He would do anything for her. He had done things that should have killed him for her, more than once, and he would do them again without a second thought. What he felt when he thought about this evening was different. It wasn't the same feeling and it didn't compete with the other one, which was the part he couldn't get his mind around cleanly. It was more like standing in a room and realizing there is a door you had never seen before. The room you're in is real. The room is good. The door doesn't change any of that, but you know the door is there now, and you can't unknow it. He wasn't sure that metaphor made sense. He was tired, and the wine had been extraordinary, and the bed behind him was the most comfortable piece of furniture he had ever been in proximity to. He turned from the window, pulled off his jacket, folded it carefully over the desk chair the way Asia had taught him, and lay down on top of the silk sheets without getting under them, still in his dress shirt, staring at the ceiling. The ceiling of the guest suite was painted too, he noticed. Not the elaborate mural of the receiving room, something simpler. A deep, velvety dark blue, with what appeared to be constellations picked out in faint gold, not the constellations of Earth's sky, but underworld ones, arrangements of stars he didn't know the names of, whose patterns he couldn't read. Someone had painted them with extraordinary care, each point of gold placed with the attention of a person who believed that the details no one else might notice were exactly the ones worth getting right. He thought, for no reason he could have immediately explained, that Venolana had painted the ceiling too, that she had stood in this room, 3 centuries ago or 1 century ago or 20 years ago, and looked up at a blank dark surface and decided it should look like a sky, that she had mixed the colors herself and climbed whatever artists climb and made something beautiful in a room where guests would sleep, so that when they opened their eyes in the morning they would see stars. It was such a specific kind of generosity. The kind that doesn't announce itself. He was asleep before he had finished the thought, the underworld dark pressing soft and total against the burgundy curtains, and the roses in the garden below perfectly still, keeping whatever they knew to themselves. He woke to light. Not the aggressive, indiscriminate light of a cool morning, not his alarm, not his mother, not the sounds of a house assembling itself into a day. The light that woke him was gentle and specific, arriving through a gap in the curtains that suggested it had been arranged rather than accidental, falling in a single warm bar across the end of the bed and no further, as if it understood the concept of personal space. He lay still for a moment, remembering where he was, the ceiling. The gold constellations. Right. He sat up, rubbed his face, and was in the process of trying to locate his jacket when a knock came at the door. Not a servant's knock. He was already developing a sense for the rhythm of the household staff, efficient and brief. This knock was measured. Unhurried. It suggested that the person on the other side had all the time in the world and had made a deliberate choice to spend some of it on this door. "Come in," he said, and then remembered he was in the Gremory family manor and probably should have said something more formal. And then the door opened, and it was too late. Venolana entered carrying a tray. Not a servant. Not staff. Venolana herself, in a morning gown of deep plum that was somehow both more casual and more elegant than anything he owned, her hair down, And that was the thing that stopped his breath for just a moment, because her hair down was different from her hair up in a way that went beyond aesthetics. Hair up was the matriarch, the noblewoman, the public face of the Gremory clan. Hair down, dark crimson falling past her shoulders with the loose authority of something that had decided to stop performing, was something else. Was someone else. Someone he had caught a glimpse of at dinner last night, underneath all that precision. "Good morning," she said, and set the tray on the writing desk with the same ease with which she did everything, as though it were entirely ordinary for the lady of the Gremory estate to personally carry breakfast to a guest room. "I hope you slept well." Yeah?" He became aware that he was sitting in a very expensive bed in a rumpled dress shirt with his hair doing whatever it had decided to do overnight, and attempted to run a hand through it with subtlety. "Did you? You brought breakfast?" "I did." She removed the cover from the tray, tea, and something that looked like eggs prepared in a way he didn't recognize but that smelled extraordinary, and bread, and fruit he'd never seen before, small and dark, like blackberries but elongated. "I gave your suit to be pressed this morning. It will be returned within the hour. I noticed last night that the collar was slightly overtreated. Whoever pressed it was very enthusiastic." Issei thought of Asia and her 40 minutes and felt a surge of complicated affection. "It was done with a lot of care," he said. Venolana's eyes softened in a way that was very small and very genuine. "I could tell," she said. "Eat. I'd like to show you the gardens this morning, if you're willing." He was willing. He ate. The eggs were extraordinary, the fruit tasted like summer and dark wine, the tea was something floral and warm that he suspected would ruin him for ordinary tea forever, and Venolana sat in the chair by the window while he did, not watching him with the evaluating attention of the night before but simply present. Comfortable in the room in a way that made him comfortable in it too. She looked out at the rose garden below with an expression that was, he thought, as close to unguarded as she allowed herself in company. "Did you paint this ceiling?" he asked. She looked up. Considered the constellations. "Yes," she said. "A long time ago. The receiving room too. And most of the guest rooms," she said. "And the main corridor, and the library, and a number of places in between. I go through periods." She looked back at the window. "Zioticus, my husband, used to say I was the only person he knew who redecorated the way other people journaled." There was something in the way she said "used to say," not grief exactly, because he suspected Venolana had long since made her peace with whatever her marriage was, but a kind of deliberate distance, the way you hold a thing at arm's length not because it's dangerous but because examining it too closely is simply not useful. He didn't push. He finished his tea. The rose garden in daylight was different from the rose garden seen through glass at midnight. It was larger than it had appeared from above, much larger, with paths that turned and deepened, leading through formal arrangements into something wilder toward the center, where the geometric precision gave way to a kind of controlled abundance. Roses climbing stone walls, roses trained along iron structures into shapes that were almost but not quite architectural, roses of colors he hadn't seen from the window. Deep red, yes, but also a deep gold that was almost orange, and a white so pure it was nearly blue at the edges, and a purple so dark it was nearly black. Venolana walked beside him without the formality of the night before, not that she had abandoned composure, because he was starting to understand that composure was not a performance for her but simply the shape of her, the way some people are inherently loud and some inherently still. But something had loosened, marginally. She walked close enough that he was aware of her proximity without it being stated. She touched the roses as they passed, just her fingertips, brushing the outer petals, with the absent tenderness of someone handling things they have loved for a long time. "My mother planted these," she said, pausing beside a particularly large bush of the deep gold variety. 300 years before I was born. They were established by the time I was a child. I used to come here when things felt too large." "Too large?" he said. "When I was young," she said, and there was a deliberateness to the words, as though she was choosing them from a larger number of available words and picking these specific ones for specific reasons. "I was primarily understood in terms of what I represented. The Bale connection. The eventual Gremory alliance. The political significance of my existence." She touched the gold rose again. "It becomes, I think the human word is claustrophobic. To be so thoroughly understood in terms of your function." Issei thought about this for a moment. Did you ever just tell people that? She looked at him. Which people? Anyone. The people around you. One does not simply tell people in my position, she said, though it wasn't dismissive, more like explaining a system she had not built and had mixed feelings about. There are codes. Expectations. One learns to be very good at being the thing everyone needs you to be. And here? He gestured at the garden. This is where you didn't have to be? She was quiet for a moment. The underworld sky above them was its own particular shade, not the blue of Earth, but something in between blue and violet, deep and somehow close, like a ceiling that had decided to be a sky. The roses were very still. Yes, she said finally. Here I could be simply a person who liked roses and had paint on her hands and didn't need to be anything else for a while. She looked at him with those deep violet eyes, and in the garden's light, without the candlelight's warmth and drama, they were a different thing, clear, direct, more vulnerable than he suspected she was aware of. You're very easy to talk to, she said. I'm not sure that's a quality I've encountered frequently. People tell me that sometimes, he said. I think it's because I don't really have much of a filter. I just say what's in my head. It doesn't leave much room for subtext. No, she agreed. It doesn't. I find that remarkable. Most people, in my experience, are composed almost entirely of subtext. She turned back to the path, and he fell into step beside her. In my world, saying precisely what you mean is either an act of supreme power or supreme naivete. The powerful ones can afford the vulnerability because nothing can touch them. The naive ones simply haven't learned yet that they should be afraid. Which one am I? She considered him for longer than felt comfortable, in the way she had of making consideration feel like something you were inside rather than something happening to you. I haven't decided, she said. I'm leaning toward a third option. Which is? Someone who has been afraid many times, she said, and has said what he meant anyway. That's neither power nor naivete. That's something rarer. She paused at a fork in the path, where the formal arrangements gave way to the wilder center. Courage is the common word for it, but that word has become so attached to battle that it has lost some of its finer meaning. I prefer conviction. You say what you mean because you've decided that being known accurately is worth the risk of being known. Issei was quiet for a moment. I never thought of it that way. That's because it comes naturally to you, she said. People rarely think carefully about the things that cost them nothing. They stood at the center of the garden, surrounded by the abundance of roses climbing their stone walls, the dark purple ones nearest here and the gold ones catching what light fell from the underworld sky. He was aware, again, of her proximity. Of the particular quality of being stood beside someone who usually kept the world at a certain remove and had not, for reasons she had not fully stated, done so with him. She looked at him with the expression he'd caught the edge of at dinner the night before, that layered, carefully managed thing beneath the composure, that door he didn't have a name for yet. I'm glad you came, she said. Simply, without architecture. Just the words. I'm glad you invited me, he said. Either of them moved. The roses held their positions. The deep violet sky sat close and luminous overhead. Then a servant appeared at the path's entrance, tactfully distant, announcing without words that the world existed and had requirements, and Venolana straightened, fractionally, and the moment completed itself and became the past. Your suit should be ready, she said, and her voice was composed and warm and precise, and he was not sure, looking at her, whether he had imagined the softness of the minute before or whether she had simply returned it to wherever she kept the things she couldn't afford to leave out. He followed her back through the roses toward the manor. His collar, when the suit was returned, was pressed perfectly, not over-treated, not enthusiastic. Simply right. He looked at it in the mirror of the guest suite and thought that even in this, Venolana had been paying attention. He thought that was probably the most dangerous thing about her. Not her power, not her beauty, not her centuries of experience and political gravity. The fact that she paid attention. The fact that she looked at things, at him, with the full, unfiltered weight of her notice, and that being looked at that way felt like being understood in a language you didn't know you spoke. He straightened his collar, his own hands, no one else's, and went to find out what the rest of the day held. The training room was in the lower levels of the manor. Issei hadn't known the manor had lower levels. He was revising, constantly and rapidly, his understanding of what the Gremory estate actually was, because from the outside it had appeared to be a large, beautiful house, and from the inside it kept revealing itself to be something closer to a small, self-contained world. There were wings he hadn't seen, corridors that turned in directions that didn't correspond to the exterior dimensions, rooms that appeared to serve no function except beauty, and rooms that served very specific functions indeed, and the lower levels, reached by a staircase of dark stone behind a door he would never have identified as a door, fell decisively into the second category. The training room was large. Stone-floored, high-ceilinged, lit by magical lights that burned cold and white and even, without the amber warmth of the rest of the manor, functional light, the kind designed not to flatter but to reveal. There were markings on the floor in old Enochian script that Issei couldn't read but that pulsed faintly underfoot, and the walls were lined with reinforced panels that had clearly absorbed a great deal of force over a great many years. The air tasted different down here. Denser. Charged, like the moment before lightning. He had been standing in the center of it for approximately 30 seconds when Venolana arrived. She was dressed differently than she had been in the garden. A deep burgundy training coat, close-fitted, with her hair drawn back in a severe and practical arrangement that he hadn't seen before. She carried nothing. She needed nothing. She looked at the room the way someone looks at a place they have known very well for a very long time, and at him with the particular focused attention of someone who has decided to do a thing properly. I spoke with Rias last night, she said by way of greeting. Issei straightened. Is everything all right with the review? Everything is fine. She asked, at some length, whether you were comfortable. Venolana's expression carried a shade of something that might have been amusement in a person less composed. I told her you were settling in. She seemed relieved, and then immediately suspicious of her own relief, which is very like her. She studied him. She didn't ask me to train you. No, he said. This was your idea. It was, she said. Do you know why? He thought about the honest answer versus the careful answer, and chose the honest one. Because she had already made clear she had no patience for the alternative. Because you want to see what I can actually do, he said. Not what I've done in raiding games or what Rias has told you. You want to see it yourself. Yes, she said, without the slight surprised approval he might have expected, just simple confirmation, as though his accuracy was assumed. And because what I see will determine what I think you still need. Rias is an exceptional teacher, but she teaches from love, which introduces a particular kind of blind spot. She sees your potential more clearly than your gaps. She moved to a position opposite him with a fluid economy of motion. I will see both equally. Issei rolled his shoulders. Felt the familiar pre-combat settling of his mind, the way thought simplified and clarified when physical reality was about to make demands. Okay, he said. What do? We begin simply, she said. Show me your base state. No boosted gear, no scaling. Just you. He moved. He'd been training long enough that his base state was not nothing. Rias had made sure of that, and Aquino, and the grinding reality of fights that hadn't waited for him to be ready. He was fast. Not Kiba fast, not the supernatural speed of someone built for it, but fast in the way that someone becomes when they have been forced to develop every natural capacity they possess because the alternative was dying. His footwork was solid. His strikes were direct and committed. He crossed the space between them in less than a second and stopped, not because he chose to stop. Because something had caught him, not a grab, not a barrier, but a pressure, a field of force so finely calibrated that it had intercepted the kinetic energy of his movement and redirected it downward, leaving him standing 2 feet from Venolana with his weight distributed incorrectly and his momentum entirely gone, like a wave that had met the right geometry of shore and simply ceased to be a wave. She had not moved. Your left shoulder telegraphs, she said, with the tone of someone making a neutral observation about weather. Not dramatically, but to someone who knows how to read bodies, it announces your direction approximately a quarter second before you commit. At your current level, against opponents of similar strength, it doesn't matter. Against opponents significantly above your level, that quarter second is the difference between a fight and a conclusion. He reset his stance. Process this. How do I fix it? You become aware of it consciously before you can correct it unconsciously, she said. Again. He moved again. This time he was aware of the shoulder. Actively, effortfully aware, in the way that you are aware of your own breathing once someone has mentioned it, and that awareness created its own problem. A fraction of hesitation as his conscious mind tried to supervise what his body was doing, and that hesitation was, apparently, worse than the telegraph. She stopped him again. Same method. Same no movement. The field of force, precise and effortless. You're thinking about it, she said. You told me to think about it. I told you to be aware of it, she said. Those are different things. Awareness is background. Thought is foreground. You've promoted it to foreground and now it's interfering with your movement. She regarded him with those clear, evaluating eyes. You do this in other areas of your life too, I suspect. You overthink the things that should be instinct and act on instinct in things that require thought. It's very human. That sounds like a criticism. It's an observation, she said. Criticism implies judgment. I don't judge structural tendencies, I work with them. She tilted her head. Again. Don't think about the shoulder. Think about me. He blinked. What? Focus on me, she said. Not on your own body. Not on the mechanics. On me, as your target, as the variable you can't control. Your body knows how to move. Stop supervising it and let it. He tried this. It worked better. Not perfectly, she stopped him a third time, and a fourth, but each time with marginally less ease, and on the fifth attempt he got close enough that she had to move, one step, elegant and minimal, to redirect rather than simply intercept. She did it without any apparent effort, which was both humbling and impressive in a ratio he couldn't quite calculate. Better, she said. It was the first evaluative word she had offered. It landed with the weight of considerably more than its syllable count. They worked for 2 hours. He had trained with Rias, with Aquino, with Kiba, who was supernaturally gifted and trained him with a kind of earnest competitive generosity. He had trained with Tannen the dragon, which had been less training and more controlled near-death experience. He had trained, in ways that didn't formally count as training, in every fight he'd survived by the thinnest possible margin. Training with Venolana was different from all of these. She was not trying to push him past his limits. She was not trying to toughen him through survival. She was, with a precision that suggested she had been doing this for centuries and had thought carefully about its theory as well as its practice, systematically identifying the specific gaps between what he was and what he could be, and then, with remarkable efficiency, showing him exactly where to push. Not everywhere at once, not the overwhelming flood of Tannen's approach. The specific pressure point. The single degree of adjustment. The one conceptual reframe that unlocked a cascade of physical improvement. It was, he thought, between the 4th and 5th rounds of a defensive exercise she had designed on the spot and described to him in 30 seconds, the most intelligent approach to teaching he had ever encountered. You're surprised, she said during a pause in which he was catching his breath and she appeared to require no such accommodation. By what? By the methodology, she said. You expected something more, demonstrative. I guess I expected you to be more. He searched for the word. Overwhelming. You're one of the most powerful devils alive. I thought you'd just show me what power looks like at your level and let me figure out what to do with that. That approach has its uses, she said. For motivation. For perspective. For breaking certain kinds of psychological resistance. She considered him. You don't need any of those things. You have motivation in quantities that border on the self-destructive, your perspective on the gap between your current ability and the ceiling of what's possible is already clear to you, and your psychological resistance to challenge is essentially non-existent. She paused. What you need is precision. You are, in the language of material science, a strong alloy with inconsistent grain structure. The strength is real. The inconsistency is what gets you hurt. Issei turned this over in his mind. Inconsistent grain structure, he repeated. The potential is homogeneous, she said. The development has been reactive rather than systematic. You've grown in response to necessity. That produces impressive results, but uneven ones. Some capacities are dramatically overdeveloped because necessity demanded them repeatedly. Others remain in early stages because they haven't been tested. She looked at him steadily. I want to address the second category. Why? He said. Not defensively, genuinely. Why do you want to do that? For me specifically. She was quiet for a moment. The training room's cold white light caught the angles of her face with a clarity the manor's warmer lights didn't permit. She looked, in this light, not less beautiful but differently so, less like a painting and more like a person. Precise and real and slightly less defended than she perhaps intended. Because my daughter loves you, she said. And I have watched her love things with her whole self since she was a child. People, ideas, possibilities. And I have watched the world fail those investments more times than I would have chosen. I would prefer not to watch that happen again. She held his gaze. You will face things that will try to kill you. Regularly, and with increasing ambition. I want to make it marginally less easy for them to succeed. It was the most direct statement of care he had heard from her. Framed as practicality, measured in its delivery, but care nonetheless, as unambiguous, beneath the precision, as anything Asia had ever said to him with tears in her eyes. He felt it land somewhere important. Okay, he said. What's next? Her almost smile arrived and departed. Your magical sensing, she said. Sit down. The magical sensing exercise was nothing like combat. It was, in fact, almost entirely interior, a practice of stillness and attention that was approximately the opposite of everything Issei's training had been built around. Venolana explained it in the measured, patient way she explained everything. He was to extend his awareness outward from his own aura, like a hand reaching into water, and try to map what he encountered, the signature of another person's power. The texture of it. The specific quality that distinguished one magical presence from another. Close your eyes, she said. He did. What do you feel? He reached, or tried to. His awareness of his own power was good. The boosted gear had forced a kind of intimacy with his own magical nature that he wouldn't have developed otherwise. But extending outward was different. Outward was ambient, diffuse, requiring a sensitivity that felt foreign to the directional bluntness of his usual approach. I feel, he tried. The room. The markings on the floor. They're doing something, some kind of structuring, like a frame. He concentrated. And you? A pause. Describe it. He focused on the edge of her presence, the specific quality of the power she was not currently using but simply carrying, the way you carry your own weight without thinking about it. It's layered, he said slowly. Like there's a surface and then, more underneath. A lot more. It's like standing near the ocean and only seeing the waves. He paused. And he searched for the word. It's old. It feels old. Not in a bad way. In the way that old things feel solid. Like it's been settled for a long time. Like a mountain. Another pause. Longer. Open your eyes, she said. He did. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Something unguarded and slightly surprised, the careful architecture of her composure not gone but briefly bypassed, the way a very controlled person's face sometimes shows a true thing before they can prevent it. That's accurate, she said. Remarkably so, for a first attempt. Did I say something wrong? No, she said. You said something very right. Most people, when they first attempt this exercise, describe power in visual or auditory terms, bright or loud, that kind of thing. You described it in terms of depth and age and physical mass. She regarded him with that clear, direct gaze. That's a more sophisticated framework. It suggests your instinctive sense of power is more nuanced than your technical training has caught up with. Is that the inconsistent grain structure thing? Yes, she said. Exactly that. She sat across from him, cross-legged on the stone floor, which was a posture so unexpectedly casual that it briefly stopped his thoughts entirely. Again, but this time, try to feel the individual layers. Not the surface. What's underneath it? He closed his eyes again. He reached toward her. The surface was what he'd described, that oceanic vastness, old and settled, the specific gravity of power that had been accumulated and refined over centuries. But underneath it, as he concentrated, paying attention in the way she taught him during the combat exercises, not thinking, just aware, he found something else. Not less vast but different in quality, warmer, more present. The power was ancient, but the person was immediate, was here, 3 feet away, on a stone floor, in a training coat, with her hair pulled back and something true in her face that the manor's warmer light had never quite caught. He became aware, with a clarity that was entirely inconvenient, of the specific quality of the space between them, of the fact that he had closed his eyes and reached outward and found her, and that she was not, in this moment, performing anything at all. He opened his eyes. She was watching him with that true expression still on her face, slightly more visible now, the something softer, the thing she allowed herself in unmeasured doses, the quality that the garden had shown him and that the manor's formal spaces carefully curated. In the training room's honest light, with no candlelight and no architecture of occasion, it was simply there. Either of them spoke for a moment. You felt it, she said. Not a question. The second layer, he said. Yeah. What did you find? He thought about honesty versus discretion and chose honesty, because she had established that as the operating principle of whatever this was between them, and he wasn't going to undermine it now. Someone who's been carrying a lot of things for a very long time, he said. And who is, I don't know. Tired of only being seen from the outside. The silence that followed was of the kind that has weight. Venolana looked at him, directly, steadily, without any of the protective management she brought to bear in other contexts, and something passed across her face that was not the almost smile and was not the evaluating attention and was not the composed elegance of the Gremory matriarch. It was something quieter and more significant, the expression of a person who has been understood, specifically and accurately, and is deciding what to do with that. She looked away first. At the Enochian markings on the floor, at the reinforced walls, at the room that had contained the power of her family for generations. You're perceptive, she said. Her voice was even and composed. Only someone paying the kind of attention she had been teaching him to pay would have heard what was underneath the evenness. Dangerously so. Is that a problem? She was quiet for a moment, that held more than quiet usually does. Ask me again in a few days, she said. They trained for another hour after that. The second hour was different from the first in a way that was difficult to quantify but impossible to miss. Something had shifted in the dynamic between them, not dramatically, not with the kind of obvious tectonic movement that demanded acknowledgement, but the way a room's temperature shifts when the light through the window changes angle. The same room. A different quality of air. She was still precise. Still measured. Still the best teacher he had ever trained under, in the particular sense of most effective, most intelligent, most attuned to the specific shape of his capacities and gaps. None of that changed. But there was a ease now, a marginally reduced distance between instruction and person, between Lady Venolana Gremory and the woman who sat cross-legged on stone floors and painted ceilings when she was lonely and kept her truest self. Behind the composure like a door she had almost never opened. She corrected his footwork with a hand on his ankle, briefly and without drama. She demonstrated a blocking technique by guiding his forearm with her fingers, showing the angle. She stood behind him once to correct his shoulder position and said there in a voice that was close and quiet, and the words settled between them like something that meant more than its syllable count, and neither of them said anything about it. At the end of the second hour she called a stop with the same efficient brevity with which she ran everything. Tomorrow morning, she said, we'll work on your aura management. You have significant power and very little finesse with it, which is common in your position and fixable with attention. She looked at him steadily. Unless you'd prefer to return to Co. It was offered without pressure. Genuinely offered, the option was real, the choice was his, she would not have held it against him. He knew that with the certainty of someone who was learning to read a person, slowly and carefully, layer by layer. I'll stay, he said. Something happened in her eyes. Very brief. Very quiet. Good, she said, and left the training room without looking back, which was, he was coming to understand, how Venolana Gremory handled moments that threatened to be larger than she had planned for. He stood alone in the training room for a moment, in the cold white light, his heart rate gradually returning to something ordinary, and thought about what she had said earlier. You said something very right? He looked at his hands. The hands that drag lid behind. The hands that had held off opponents that should have been categorically beyond him, through a combination of power and stubbornness, and the refusal to accept that the gap between what he was and what a situation required was something other than a problem to be solved. He thought about the second layer. The warmth underneath the vast, settled surface. The person underneath the matriarch. He thought, this is becoming something. He thought, I don't know what it is yet. He thought, I should probably figure that out before it figures itself out for me. He turned off the training room light and went upstairs, and the manor received him with its usual unhurried warmth, and somewhere in it Venolana was already composing herself back into the shape the world expected her to be, doing it with the practice of centuries, doing it well. But he had seen underneath it now, and the seeing was the kind that didn't reverse. He was beginning to understand why she had said dangerously so. Chapter 4. Secrets over Candlelight. Dinner on the third night was supposed to be formal. Issei knew this because the servant who came to his room at 6 o'clock to inform him that dinner would be served at 8 arrived with a press suit, not his own charcoal gray, which had been returned to him after the first night's pressing, but something new, laid across the servant's arm with the careful horizontal presentation of something that mattered. Dark navy, perfectly cut, with a shirt so white it seemed to generate its own light. He stood in front of the mirror in the guest suite and looked at himself in it, and thought that whoever had selected it had known his measurements without asking him, which was either impressive or unsettling and was probably both. He came downstairs at 8 exactly. The formal dining room, not the intimate one of the first night, but the larger room he had glimpsed through a half-open door on his second day, the one with the long table that could see 30, and the chandelier that appeared to be made of frozen light, was set at one end. 2 places. The full arrangement of crystal and silverware and candles and tall holders, everything perfectly symmetrical, perfectly formal. The Gremory crest worked into the napkin folds with an origami precision that seemed like a tremendous amount of effort for something that would be immediately unfolded. Venolana was already there. She wore deep crimson, a departure from the burgundy and plum of the previous days, and the color did something specific to the room, to the candlelight, to the whole arrangement of the evening. It was the color of the roses at the garden's heart. The color of the Gremory crest. She wore it the way people wear things that belong to them completely, without performance or calculation, and her hair was up again in the formal arrangement, and she looked, Issei thought, with the helpless accuracy that seemed to be becoming a habit, like someone who had decided to remind him of exactly what she was. You're punctual, she said, as he approached the table. Asia drilled it into me, he said. She has strong feelings about punctuality. She sounds formidable. She's the most genuinely kind person I've ever met, he said. Which turns out to be its own kind of formidable. Venolana considered this as a servant pulled out his chair. Yes, she said. It does. The first 2 courses passed in the register of the first night, composed, elegant, the conversation moving through topics with the unhurried intelligence that he was coming to recognize as simply how Venolana talked. She asked about the peerage, and he told her about each of them with the particular warmth of someone describing people he had chosen and who had chosen him back. Kiba's quiet honor, Kaniko's compressed fierceness, Gasper's terrified bravery, Asia's inexhaustible gentleness. She listened to each description with full attention and occasionally asked a question so precise that it reframed the thing he'd just said, showed him an angle of his own people he hadn't consciously articulated before. You love them, she said? All of them. Not as a group. Each of them specifically. Yeah, he said. Is that unusual, in a king-piece dynamic? She reached for her wine. More than you might think. Kings tend toward investment, rather than love. The distinction matters. Investment is conditional on performance. Love isn't. She looked at him over the rim of her glass. Rias loves her pieces the way you do. It's one of the things that makes her exceptional as a king, and occasionally one of the things that makes strategic decisions painful for her. Is that a problem? It depends on your values, she said. If your primary goal is victory, then love in a king is a liability. If your primary goal is building something worth having, then it's the entire point. She set down her glass. I know which of those I believe. I was not always permitted to act on it. He looked at her. What do you mean? She was quiet for a moment, not the considering quiet of someone choosing words, but the more careful quiet of someone deciding whether to open a particular door. He waited. He had learned, in 3 days, that Venolana's silences were not empty and should not be rushed. I had political obligations from the time I was very young, she said finally. My family standing, our alliances, the specific matrix of clan relationships that required careful management. I was prepared, from childhood, to be exactly what those obligations required. It was not unkind. My parents were not cruel people. They simply lived in a world where the personal and the political were so thoroughly interwoven that separating them would have felt like separating a person from their own spine. She looked at the candle nearest her, the flame's reflection moving in her eyes. I married Zeoticus when I was very young, by devil standards. It was the right match, the correct alignment of power and family and political advantage. He was not unkind either. A pause. We have been respectful, cooperative. We produced 2 extraordinary children, which I consider the genuine achievement of our union. But it was never, she stopped. Never what? He asked quietly. She looked at him. I was going to say it was never a choice, she said. But that's not quite accurate. I chose to embrace it. I chose to become what was needed. I chose to be very, very good at the life I was given rather than spend centuries mourning the life I wasn't. Her voice was even, but beneath the evenness was something he recognized from the training room, the second layer, the warmth below the settled surface. What I mean is that it was never, freely chosen, from a position of genuine alternatives. I didn't choose Zeoticus because I loved him. I chose to love the life we made, which is a different thing, and I want to be precise about that because precision matters to me. Issei was quiet for a moment. Did you ever love someone? He asked. Before. Or outside of that. It was a question that crossed a line. He knew it as he asked it, could feel the line under his feet the way you feel the edge of a drop in darkness. He asked it anyway, because honesty was the operating principle, and she had just been more honest with him than he suspected she was with almost anyone. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. Once. A long time ago. Someone entirely unsuitable, which is the traditional shape of those things. The almost smile arrived, but this version of it was different, older, more complex, carrying the weight of something that had been carried for a very long time. It didn't survive the obligations. These things rarely do, in my world. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be, she said. It was a long time ago, and I made my peace with it. What I carry from it is the knowledge of what it feels like to be seen completely, by someone who had no reason to see you in any particular way and simply did. She looked at him steadily. That's a specific kind of knowledge. Once you have it, you can't pretend you don't. The chandelier above them held its position, throwing its cold, precise light across the long table. The candles between them burned with a steadiness that suggested not wind but intention. The room was very quiet in the way that large, formal rooms are quiet, a contained silence, with weight. Can I say something honest? Issei said. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. I think you invited me here because you wanted that, he said carefully. Not, I don't mean, he organized his thoughts. I mean that you wanted to be seen. You wanted someone to look at you the way you described. Someone without a reason to look at you in any particular predetermined way, who would just see what was actually there. He held her gaze. And I think I'm that person because I don't know how to see people any other way. I don't have the social architecture for it. I just look at what's in front of me. The silence that followed was of the kind that changes the temperature of a room. Venolana looked at him across the candles with an expression that was not managed, not performed, not filtered through centuries of practiced composure. It was the most unguarded he had seen her, more than the garden, more than the training room's honest light, more than the moment she had looked away first after he described her second layer. This was the expression underneath all of those expressions. The thing that lived at the center, in the rose garden's wild heart, past the geometric formality. Yes, she said. Simply. Without elaboration or retreat. The word fell into the candlelit air between them and didn't disappear. The formal dinner ended at 10. The staff cleared the last course with their usual ghost efficiency and withdrew, and Issei assumed that this was the moment of the polite goodnight, the return to the East Wing guest suite, the staring at the painted constellations and the processing of things. He pushed back his chair. There's a sitting room off the east corridor, Venolana said, without moving. With a better fire than this room ever manages, and considerably more comfortable chairs, and a bottle of something I've been intending to open for approximately 60 years and have simply not found the right occasion for. She looked at him with those clear violet eyes. If you're not tired, He wasn't tired. He was, in fact, the precise opposite of tired, alert in a way that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with the specific quality of being in a conversation that mattered, with a person who was choosing, hour by hour, to let him further in. Lead the way, he said. The sitting room off the east corridor was, as advertised, better. Smaller than almost everything else in the manor. Intimate was the word, used architecturally rather than as a suggestion. 2 chairs angled toward a fireplace of dark stone, a low table between them, bookshelves on 2 walls populated with volumes that appeared to be actually read rather than decoratively arranged, their spines worn and their positions uneven in the way of things that have been removed and replaced many times. A single lamp. The bottle Venolana opened was deep amber, and it poured with a viscosity that suggested age and patience in equal measure. He tasted it. It was extraordinary. Not wine, something older and more complex, warm in the way that warmth is its own flavor, carrying in it something that tasted, he thought, like a very specific afternoon in a season he didn't have a name for. What is this? He asked. There isn't a human equivalent, she said. The nearest analogy is brandy. But that's like saying the nearest analogy to a symphony is a whistle. She settled into her chair with her own glass, and in the firelight she was different again, softer in the literal sense, the sharp, precise lines of the formal dining room replaced by something warmer and less defended. The crimson gown caught the fire's light and gave it back changed. It was made by a devil who has been dead for 4 centuries. He produced 11 bottles in his lifetime. I have 2 of the remaining 3. You saved it for 60 years looking for the right occasion, Issei said. Yes. What makes tonight the right occasion? She looked at the fire for a moment. Honest company, she said. It seemed important to open it in the presence of someone I couldn't be dishonest with even if I tried. He looked at her. You could be dishonest with me. You're extraordinarily good at managing what you show people, perhaps, she said. But I find I don't want to be. Which amounts to the same thing. She turned the glass in her hands, watching the amber catch the light. That's rarer than the bottle. They sat with that for a moment, with the fire, and the extraordinary drink, and the particular quality of being 2 people in a small warm room at the end of an evening who have been, over the course of 3 days, steadily dismantling the architecture of necessary distance. Tell me something about yourself, she said. Something you don't usually tell people. He thought about it. I used to be afraid, he said, that all of this, the devil stuff, the power, the peerage, was the only reason anyone wanted me around. That without drag, without the sacred gear, I was just a regular kid with no particular qualities. Mediocre grades. Embarrassing hobbies. He looked at his glass. I used to think Rias kept me around because I was useful. Because of what I could eventually become. Not because of what I was already. And now I think I was wrong, he said. I think Rias genuinely, he paused. But there's still a piece of it that isn't totally gone. The question of whether who I actually am, without any of the power attached, is enough. He looked at her. Does that make sense? It makes complete sense, she said, and her voice had the quality it had taken on in the training room when she said you said something very right. A resonance underneath the evenness, something struck. I have felt a version of that my entire life. Not about power. About function. Purpose. The question of whether Venolana Gremory, without the clan affiliation and the political significance, and the roles she performs, is someone worth, she paused. Worth simply being in a room with, for no reason other than that. Yes, he said. That exactly. They looked at each other. The fire moved between them, and the amber drink held its warmth. And outside this small room the manor was large and quiet and old, and somewhere in the underworld Rias was sleeping or working or thinking about him. Probably in that order. Probably with the same mixture of feelings he carried when he thought about her. He thought about her now, and it was real, and it mattered, and it sat alongside what was in this room without canceling it, because feelings were not zero-sum even when they were complicated. That was something he had not understood 6 months ago, and understood now with the specific clarity of someone in the middle of learning it. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask me anything. What do you want? He said. Not for Rias, not for the clan, not for the political situation, or the raiding games or any of it. Just, Venolana. What does she want? The question landed in the room and stayed there. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he had time to wonder if he had gone too far, crossed the line he felt earlier more definitively than he'd intended. But she didn't look away. She held the question, and she held his gaze, and she held her glass, and in the firelight she was the most fully present he had seen her in 3 days. No management, no careful calibration, no architecture of occasion. Just a person in a chair, being asked what she wanted by someone who actually wanted to know. To be surprised, she said finally. By something genuine. Something that doesn't fit the shape of things I was given and learned to inhabit. Her voice was very quiet. I have had an enormous life, Issei. I have had power and beauty and children and centuries and the respect of every devil alive. I have had almost everything that can be arranged. She paused. I haven't had many surprises. He was quiet for a moment. Is this one? He asked. Her eyes were very still. In the fire's warm light they were not the administrative violet of the receiving room, or the clear evaluating color of the training room. They were something older and more honest. Something that had been waiting behind the other expressions the way the second layer waited beneath the surface of her power. Yes, she said. You are. They talked until very late. Not about anything, about everything, the way conversations go when the hour is right, and the company is right, and the extraordinary amber drink does what it was apparently made to do, which was dissolve the remaining distance between people who had already been working at it for 3 days. He told her about his father's laugh, and the specific smell of his mother's kitchen, and the first time he'd seen Rias and thought he'd never seen anyone so vivid in his life. She told him about the underworld 3 centuries ago, what it had been, what it had looked like before certain wars reshaped it, what it felt like to have watched entire geographies change. She told him about learning to paint, which had started as a discipline and become a compulsion and then settled into something in between, a practice, like meditation but with the specific pleasure of making something that hadn't existed before. She told him about Rias as a child. This was the thing that undid him a little, not the political confessions, not the careful revelation of the woman behind the matriarch, but the way Venolana talked about her daughter when the formality was all the way down, warm and precise and proud in a way that was too deep to be performance. Pride that had been accumulating for decades and had never quite found the right container. Rias at 5, destroying a training dummy and crying because she'd frightened herself. Rias at 12, staying up all night to learn a magical theory she'd been told was too advanced for her, arriving at breakfast the next morning with correct answers and shadows under her eyes. Rias at the age she'd first told her parents she intended to build her own peerage on her own terms, with her chin up in a way that did not invite disagreement. She has your eyes, he said. Venolana smiled. Not the almost smile. An actual smile, unguarded and full, the first he had seen, and it transformed her face in a way that made something in his chest do something complicated. She has my stubbornness, she said. The eyes are coincidental. I think she has your precision too, he said. The way she sees things clearly and then acts on what she sees without hedging. That's you? Venolana looked at him for a moment. You see a great deal, she said. You taught me to look at the second layer. She laughed. It was a small sound, brief and genuine, arrived and gone before the room had quite registered it, but real. Entirely real. He filed it carefully in the part of his mind that was keeping track of the things Venolana Gremory did when she forgot to be only what everyone expected. At some point well past midnight the fire had burned low, and the bottle had been reduced to its final inch, and the conversation had moved from words into the specific silence of people who have run out of necessary things to say and are simply choosing to remain in proximity to each other because the proximity itself is the point. Issei looked at the fire. Venolana looked at the fire. Outside the sitting room the manor breathed in its old, quiet way, and the roses held their positions in the dark garden, and the painted constellations waited on the guest's sweet ceiling. I should sleep, he said. He didn't move. Yes, she said. She didn't move either. The fire settled lower. The room was very warm. Venolana, he said, and her name in his mouth felt different than it had the first time he'd used it, fuller, more inhabited, carrying the weight of 3 days of careful, cumulative knowing. She turned her head and looked at him. Her expression was the true one, the one from the garden center, from the training room's cold light. from the moment across the dinner table when she had said yes to the question of whether she wanted to be seen. Fully present and fully honest and fully herself, the layers all visible at once. You should sleep, she said again softly. I know, he said. Neither of them moved for another long moment. Then she stood, graceful and inevitable, like a tide, and he stood, and they were standing close in the small warm room with the firelight very low, and she looked at him with those honest eyes for one more moment of the kind that had weight, and temperature, and the specific gravity of a choice being made. She reached up and very briefly, very deliberately, touched his face. Her fingertips against his jaw, the lightest possible pressure, the gesture so contained and so precise that it was almost formal, except that it wasn't formal at all. It was the opposite of formal. It was the most unguarded thing she had done in 3 days. Good night, Issei, she said. Her hand dropped. She stepped back. She was composed again, not entirely, the warmth still visible around the edges of the composure like light around a door, and she left the sitting room with her usual quiet authority, and the sound of her footsteps faded down the east corridor, and the manor was still. He stood alone in the dying firelight. His hand came up and touched his own jaw, where her fingers had been. He stood there for a while. Then he went to bed, and looked at the painted constellations, and did not sleep for a very long time.